It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Thad Kousser. Professor Kousser has been in Adelaide since February this year, serving as the 2015 Fulbright Flinders University Distinguished Chair in American Political Science. Professor Kousser has had a distinguished teaching and academic career, including co-authoring and editing a number of books on American politics and the American political system. He's an expert in participatory democratic institutions and has a wealth of experience in analysing their effectiveness and outcomes. Professor Kousser is a recipient of the UCSD Academic Senate's Distinguished Teaching Award and the Faculty Mentor of the Year Award. He served as co-editor of the journal State Politics and Policy Quarterly and has worked as a staff assistant in the California, New Mexico and United States Senates. Professor Kousser today will explore some of the lessons learned from a deliberative poll undertaken in California on constitutional reform. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage, Professor Thad Kousser.
Well, thanks very much, Sarah. So, how do you design the perfect deliberative process? Anyone? I expect if you knew the answers to that, you probably wouldn't be spending your morning with us. And if I had discovered the secret recipe for deliberative perfection, I might not be sharing it with you. I'd probably be selling it on an infomercial on a strange television station for civic engagement activists. But I haven't discovered it because I don't believe that the perfect deliberative process exists. Right? When anyone who's had experience in designing one of these processes has known that you have to make a series of very difficult choices, the wicked choices that Will was talking about, and that those choices don't move you ever closer to one ideal of deliberative perfection. They just move you along a continuum between competing goals that you and your organization might have. And there are inherent trade-offs between the goals of deliberation. So rather than trying to come up with a set of practices that are best for all situations, a one-size-fits-all approach to deliberation, what I want to talk through with you are how to reach a set of choices that maximize the goals that you care about for one particular process. I'm going to do that by sharing some of the experiences, some of the lessons learned, the victories and the potential and the failures from one large-scale deliberative poll process on constitutional reform in California. This is one where we had to make a series of hard choices. So I'm going to talk you through what we were trying to maximize, what we were trading off in those. Some of those were conscious decisions about trade-offs. Some of them were things that only became apparent later. And hopefully by sharing some of these hard-earned lessons with you, you'll have a sense at the end of what are the choices you need to make, how can you identify your situation's goals, be cognizant of the trade-offs, and then come up with the deliberative process that may not be perfect, but is right for you. So before diving into California, and these are some of our deliberators on constitutional reform in 2011, before diving into that, let's pull back and talk about these deliberative ideals. Now, the deliberative democracy is kind of a concept of modern political theorists, but the idea of getting citizens to engage with each other, think hard, meet each other on an equal footing, and not use power relationships, but use ideas to come to collective decisions, is as old as democracy itself. So in Athens about 2,500 years ago, when democracy is really born, there are three processes of governments, but one of them is really citizen engagement, right? So the ecclesia, which would meet downhill from the Acropolis here on the Punix, was this direct democracy. Any citizen of Athens could take part in it. And they would meet almost every week. So it had about 40 meetings every year, and 40,000 citizens were allowed to come there. And we kind of have this vision, right, of Socrates and Plato and togas sitting around having high-minded discussions with each other. Right? And that's this ideal that we're always trying to harken back to. Now, first, this idea was never ideal. So from the start, the ecclesia was plagued by low turnout, right? Greeks had wars to fight, they had Olympics to train for. Only, the most you'd only get 5,000 people, so very low turnout percentages. And look, not all of these people were the great philosophers of the world, and power relationships and populist arguments were part of this from the start. But that hasn't stopped more modern political institutions from taking the idea up. In the United States, we have across New England a tradition of town hall meetings that actually is older than the U.S. is as a country, that bring together everyone from a town. So this is one Vermont town hall meeting every year to come up with usually state budgets and at least the school budget. So they meet together, and there's been a decent amount of research on these. There are many wonderful aspects of these town halls, but you see some people talking much more than others, right? The elite, the powerful, the business people, the well-educated are dominating conversations. You see a lot of sort of herd mentality with, these are fairly homogenous areas, but even so, when they vote in public, everyone moves together in one direction, and so that's caused many of these cities and townships in recent years to move to private voting. Adopting the Australian ballot is what we call it in the United States, voting in private rather than voting in public, and you've seen very different outcomes based on that because people aren't intimidated by social norms and showing off to everyone else. So the point I want to make with these is there have always been difficulties in running citizen engagement processes, especially these ones that are so empowered by political institutions. The one that I got a lot of direct experience in was, and then if you even go to the representative democracy form, right, our legislatures, these paragons of democracy, you've seen, as Will referred to, tremendous dysfunction in recent years. This is one congressman shouting down our president during his State of the Union address and accusing him of being a liar. And we even see, this was when Malcolm Turnbull came to Adelaide, and you see people protesting him. You see, a breakdown of civility even in sort of our most esteemed elite discourse, right? So that means that's going to be a challenge in all of our more locally focused citizen engagement processes. The way that I became involved in this deliberative poll was a few years ago during the global financial crisis. California's budget was out of whack, about $30 billion in deficit. And the state legislature, the folks in Sacramento, were very slow to address it. That meant cuts to all the areas of state government. Our freeways were crumbling. Our prisons were overcrowded under Supreme Court order. Our schools needed more funding. The legislature wanted to handle it on its own, but there was tremendous dissatisfaction and distrust with Sacramento. That's our state capital, Sacramento government. And people all across the state wanted to directly engage. And there was a big movement even to completely rewrite the rules of state government, rewrite our state constitution by holding a citizens' constitutional convention, right? A randomly selected group of people who would rewrite the state constitution. This idea gained a lot of traction. It came out of Silicon Valley. Business leaders were funding it. Arnold Schwarzenegger, our governor, very publicly endorsed it. And we came very close to having what British Columbia has had, which is a true citizens' constitutional convention. Doesn't happen for various reasons, and so the deliberative poll that was held a year later was an attempt to kind of create an unofficial constitutional convention. South Australia has been through a similar process, and you've seen the complexities of these issues. And these issues are really too complex to be dealt with through a traditional poll. So during this constitutional crisis, I had brought together universities across the state. We jointly funded a couple polls on what people wanted to do in rewriting their constitution. And I remember very clearly being up in Sacramento presenting this to some members of our state legislature. And one of the senators said, look, these are really complicated issues that we wrestle with for months and months and months. You're asking someone a one-paragraph long question in a poll, and they think about it for 10 seconds, and you expect us to believe this? All right? And I had to admit that she had a very good point. And so that was part of why I was really happy to be involved in this deliberative poll on reform held in 2011. Now, what is a deliberative poll? This is a a methodology that has been sort of one clear model that has been developed by two political scientists, a guy named Jim Fishkin, who's a political theorist at Stanford University, and Bob Luskin, who's a political behavior specialist at the University of Texas. They came up with this idea, I think, going back to the 1980s. And they've used this across the world, many countries, national governments, with the European Union, to help get a random sample of citizens in a room for a weekend. Come in on Friday afternoon, take a poll and see where they are, much as you guys did this morning, right? A poll right at the beginning of the process. And then debate, both in small groups that meet, for an hour or so at a time, a group of about 18 to 20 of these individuals, and then they come back together and meet in plenary sessions, listen to experts, ask questions of those experts, go back into their small groups, and work through these issues over the course of the weekend, and take another poll before they leave. All right, and you see at the end of the day, the idea is this is now that citizens have consulted with each other, grappled hard with these complex issues. This is a much better read on what the public really want than anything that you either got on Friday or through a traditional telephone poll. So that's the deliberative polling model, and it has a lot of design choices baked into it, but when you put it into practice in any concrete way, you still need to make a lot of further choices. And my involvement was in the stages leading up to Friday. So helping to come up with craft the sort of a consensus on what the agenda for the poll would be, and then trying to come up with the background materials. So I'm going to walk you through some of the decisions we made in that process, but also through the polling process, and talk about ways to make them match with your goals. So the first thing you have to ask in any of these design choices is, who's going to participate, and how many people are going to participate? The idea with a deliberative poll and with a citizen jury, which is sort of another model of citizen engagement that's practiced a lot in the United States and that you have here in South Australia, is having a mini public, having a group of people who speak for everyone. And so that means having that group be representative is hugely important. What you can't have is either what you heard, what Will talked about in Nebraska, which is something where anyone can game the system by getting a group of activists who are there to shout down speakers across the state. And even more dangerous, but even more common, is the usual suspects. Right? So how many of you have held some kind of civic engagement meeting and seen an audience that looks very much like this audience? Right? That's what we often have. And these are wonderful people who I love, who care about politics, and you see them over and over again. Like the next year you hold another event and you see some of the same faces there. So this is one of the constant problems of having the usual suspects who tend to be more educated, more engaged, richer, whiter, just to be honest, than what you would see in the population as a whole. And so you need to actively go out and recruit people rather than letting them select themselves into the sample, right? So really there's this continuum between having a random sample of people who you've chosen or by lottery versus people who have put their own hands up and self-nominated and selected in. What are the ways that you get closer to 100% of the people who you ask actually turning out? Well, the first thing is you have to make a decision, and this brings in the trade-off, you have to make that participation possible. If you're holding a citizen jury that's going to meet 50 times or meet for a week straight during business hours, you're going to get a different group of people who are available to show up. So the state of Oregon runs a wonderful citizen jury a couple times every election year to come up with recommendations for how citizens should vote on ballot initiatives, and that involves a week straight of meetings. And they get 25 people or so, but they start with a random sample of about 10,000. So it takes a lot of invitations before they can get people to engage that deeply. And you can get a lot of deep engagement. The idea of a deliberative poll is you do it over the weekend, so you don't need to cast cast your net that wide, and instead you can try to get what all pollsters want, which is a really high response rate, a very large percentage of the people you ask to say yes and participate. The trade-off is you only have a weekend, not a full week or not a month, and not that time. So there are trade-offs, but the idea is make it a realistic limit on involvement that will get more people. What you also have to do is what Will said, recruit with a purpose. Go really hard at that sample of people who you've invited, right? Your sample is only, if you use like a random sampling technique, your sample is only random if you get most of those people who you've invited actually show up. If you cast 10,000 invitations and take the 25 who do show up, that's almost like letting people just walk in the door by themselves, right? So that means, we used the Fishkin and Bob Fishkin and Jim Luskin, their group, were calling these people back up to 10 times. Some of them said, well, you know what, I'm sorry, I'm out of the state. I'm working in another state, Washington, D.C. Well, we'll fly you back for the weekend, right? So this was expensive. It takes resources, and this poll happened to have in total about $1 million worth of funding. You won't have that in most of your experiments, but having that energy and working really hard and making it attractive and selling that idea of why this is going to be important will get you much closer to this ideal of a mini public. And then finally, one thing I like about the deliberative poll technology is that it has a check on these rose-colored glasses that we have of all our own events, where you see a group and say, oh, this looks like a really diverse group. Well, how diverse is that group in its demographics, and importantly, its attitudes? And so the way that they check on that is they have a random sample telephone poll of people who are not asked to come and spend the weekend, and then they have that random sample poll of the people who are coming for the weekend, and they can see on the issues, how similar are they? On their political ideology, how similar are they? On their demographics, how similar are they? And you could use statistical corrections at the end to accommodate for any differences, but what it turned out was we had very similar groups. So in particular, if you looked at the poll participants and California voters, this is one metric, it's just looking at their party lineup. Boy, every political civic engagement event I've done, and I've worked on the board of a group that did this for about 10 years, we'd have like 80% Democrats, right? But in California, this blue state, the percent of Democrats was actually slightly lower among the poll participants than in the California voters. So the partisan lineup looked very similar because they'd worked this sample so hard. And also the demographics were fairly diverse. So it skewed a little bit older, but not much. A little bit more open to some reform ideas, but these were like 3 or 4 percentage point differences between the sample and the random sample of all California voters. Okay, so you've got your mini public who are going to spend whatever it is, a morning, a week, a day, 30 minutes online with you. What are the choices that you're going to ask them to grapple with? That's a tremendously difficult issue, and partly it's difficult because there's so many things that are deserving to be on the agenda. So when we looked at what had been proposed for a constitutional convention on California, what all the reforms were, we started with this task of taking a census of all the ideas. So we broke it down into a few different areas, changing our tax structure, changing the way our legislature is designed, changing the way our direct democracy process worked, changing the state and local government initiative system, and we polled reform groups left, right, and center and came up with this. This is just the beginning of our Excel spreadsheet of all the proposals that were real proposals that had strong support that were out there. And the problem was you got up to 141 ideas. So that was what people, and all of them had clear backers who wanted to get them on the agenda. So how do you narrow the agenda? Well, we wanted to make this as neutral as possible. We didn't want a few academics somewhere to be deciding what was on the agenda. So we established an advisory board, and that advisory board had to be a kind of mini public of the reform sphere with people from all parts geographically of California, all parts of the political spectrum, demographic breadth. So these were the stakeholders, the sort of leaders, and they were a board that came through a process of narrowing down this agenda. And we worked through a series of, we had 4 conference calls on a conference call on each of these subjects, each of them lasting 3 hours, which was just tremendously fun, as I'm sure you guys have all experienced. And we had online voting. So we'd be sitting there on the phone, and I'd say, okay, now that we've talked about this for 15 minutes, do you think it should be on the agenda? What score, 1 to 10? What are your ratings? And had people voting on like SurveyMonkey or Doodlepoll or some online technique doing that. That was very important because even in a conference call with people who are super engaged, there's some squeaky wheels who would talk. And when you spend only 15 minutes, you'd hear from some but not others. And so just as you guys, Sarah is asking you guys to vote silently so that we don't, so that you're not sort of led by whoever's speaking the loudest, having that ability of people to cast polls so you know what everyone's thinking rather than just hearing what a few people are saying, was able to help us come up with an agenda that truly was a consensus agenda. At the end of the day, so this took a lot of time. It took people wanting to commit to this for 12 hours or more and read the background material. So you have to have people who are really engaged. And at the end of the day, we cut down from 141 to 30. Now, that was a pretty good trimming. But still, 30 big, complex reform proposals to deal with in a weekend. That agenda was, in my opinion, and after watching this through the weekend, that was too much, right? And I think it shows there's this trade-off when you create an agenda by committee. Every committee member gets something on the agenda, right? You get their buy-in, right? And this was something where really everyone who's doing reform stuff in California knew about this event and felt some stake in it. So that was something that we got out of it. But on the other hand, the agenda just got too big. And you could kind of see the train moving off the rails. But by reaching out to everyone, we just couldn't limit it to 10 reform ideas. So when you're thinking through crafting the agenda, I think there are clear trade-offs between having too large an agenda and one that is narrowly constructed just by you and doesn't have buy-in. And depending on the length of your deliberation, you're going to have to think hard about what is too much. Okay. Now, the people who were walking in to discuss 30 reform ideas couldn't just walk in on Friday afternoon cold, right? They needed to have some background on these ideas. And as Will said, this is really hard because when you're presenting them with background, you want to get the knowledge of experts out there, but you're trying to present it to just normal folks who don't spend their lives in our world dealing with these issues, right? And you want to present it in a way that doesn't intimidate them, right? So experts, we all know, don't speak ordinary language. They have strong viewpoints, so they have interests, right? Anyone who's put enough of their life in it to be an expert has a strongly staked viewpoint, and experts can be intimidating, right? People can think, I should just follow what the experts say, or God, I shouldn't even be here because this is such a complex issue. So getting past the wall of all these problems, but still bringing expert knowledge directly to people was a real challenge. I'll talk you through how we tried to do it, but I don't think, again, that I had the perfect secret recipe to do this. So I got to assemble a board of academic experts from across, so it's mostly professors and then some former agency heads from across the state, across different universities, and they were writing the background, the kind of homework that we sent to these poll participants in advance. I wanted them to write some stuff, but many of them were people who were already staked. They had a position on some of these things. They were in favor of some and opposed to the others. And so to make sure they were playing it straight, we went through a peer review process where we were paying other professors to read this, give us feedback, make sure it was balanced, make sure it was correct. And then we went to the next step of having journalists rewrite these. So political journalists, some of whom were still working in journalism, some of whom, because of the collapse of our media sector, had were looking for this kind of job, and they sort of would spend a week rewriting this into layperson's terminology. And I think that was a very important step. And then finally, we went back to our agenda advisory board to read these materials once they had gone through those two filters to make sure that they were even-handed and that they were approachable to people. So again, this is something that takes a lot of resources. And if you have, I think it was $30,000 or $40,000 that we spent just on preparing these background materials, if you have those resources, you can go through this full process. But I think that the keys there are you want to get it. Having journalists rewrite experts, I think, worked really well, and having that peer review to get neutrality was really important. At the event, the Deliberative Poll has a very strong methodology on this. Experts aren't there to preach. Experts are there to answer the questions of the participants. So they get together in their groups, and then when they came together in a plenary session like this, the experts were on the table, and they only responded to questions. Again, this involves trade-offs, right? I mean, experts, this is not how I run my political science classes, right? I feel like, wow, I've spent my life doing this. I know what people need to know, so I'll get that out there and then answer their questions. So it's very hard for some professors to deal with this. But I think the idea is you are getting people who knows best what people need to know than themselves. And so they would come up with these ideas out of their groups and then ask them. That was, I think, something that worked, but has this trade-off between sometimes we'd sit there and say, oh, this argument hasn't gotten out. This important basic fact hasn't gotten out. You have to give up control if you're going to have this participant-generated decision questioning process. The other question we had was, well, how do we deal with the fact that these experts are advocates? And how do we get away from these kind of polarizing arguments that Will was talking about, but still have people who can make the strongest pitch for their side? So what we decided was to put that out on the table, put the positions of experts out on the table, have people who are advocates, have people who are opponents of reforms, and then have usually an academic who is in the middle, make it clear to individuals, to the participants, so they knew where folks were coming from, but not hide the clear positions of experts, not pretend that they were giving you just perfectly straight knowledge. And I think overall that worked fairly well. Did the poll as a whole work? Oh, this is just an example of what some of this homework. So it ended up being about a 100-page homework packet sent to all the participants, and they had a lot of one-page. Every proposal had a one-page pro-con. Here's what it's trying to solve. Here's what it would take to do this summary. I didn't think that folks would read this. I thought they would be like my college students, and you'd have to quiz them, and without any stakes, they wouldn't do any of their work. I was shocked when I got there on Friday, and all these people had these dog-eared copies of the briefing handbook, and they were saying, oh, I had my daughter create flashcards, and she was quizzing me on this. I was astonished at the capacity of these individuals who were invested in the process enough to spend a weekend. They were going to do their homework, and I learned that they were willing to take in much more information than I thought that they were going to absorb because they were bought into this process. When they got there, they were clearly paying attention to the professors, asking them questions, hugely engaged. If you looked at what happened over the course of the weekend, you saw a lot of movement from Friday to Sunday. People changed their opinions. And there's a lot of evidence that they changed their opinions in meaningful ways. So we asked them questions about sort of political knowledge questions. They had big gains in those. We asked them about their political positions, and people moved to policy positions that were more in line with their underlying values. And we could tell that in our statistical analysis of this poll overall. And there was some sense, these connected set of proposals became more popular. These proposals that had a lot in common became less popular. So at the end of the day, most people were very happy with this process. And one thing I just want to not breeze too quickly over, but just throw out there is you're going to have to think hard about the facilitator's role. The deliberative polling methodology has a very clear stance that facilitators are there to be totally neutral. They don't set the agenda for conversations. All they do is try to make sure that everyone's broadly participating. So if they see someone who hasn't talked for a while, they say, hey, we'd love to hear from you. And so maybe every hour or so, they'll call on someone and give them the chance to step in. What that meant, what you lose from that is the ability to keep people on task. right? So I sort of sat as a fly on the wall of one of these meetings, and really every hour, almost on the hour, people would just veer into government bashing for a good 15 minutes and talk about all the things that they thought were wasteful in government, and they really had nothing to do with these proposals. But this is what people wanted to talk about, right? It's like a book club. People don't talk about the book the whole time, and if you don't have a strong facilitator keeping them on task, you're going to lose some of your valuable conversation going there. So there's a trade-off between a facilitator who's completely neutral and a facilitator who helps drive the agenda and keep people on topic, and being able to do that without them steering towards a particular outcome is a real tough trick that I think you should think hard about that. But again, I don't have the perfect answer to that. Finally, what came out of this experiment, this grand-scale experiment of civic deliberation? A TV show came out of it, so our version of ABC with this national anchor was there, created a very good 1-hour documentary that aired across the state and showed people that California government was listening and that normal folks could grapple with these issues. And there's, we did a lot of press releases on what the results were, took them to policymakers. But there wasn't a clear connection, since this was a non-governmental poll. There wasn't a clear group of politicians who were waiting to hear what the poll came up with and put it into action. California has a proposition process, a process by which citizens or organized groups of citizens or really rich citizens who have the money to fund ballot signature drives can then put something on the ballot for a direct vote of the public. And that is the way that sort of these outside meetings can get on the public agenda. And so a proposition called, it was Proposition 31 in California that was backed by this group called California Forward, kind of came out of the deliberative poll. It was some ideas that this group had been working on for a while, but they polled really well in the deliberative poll, and so they took 5 of the most popular ideas from this deliberative poll, put them on the ballot in a proposition. And if you looked at how these things polled on both Friday and Sunday, they polled like in the 70s, 75% on Friday, 85% on Sunday. You put them together in an omnibus package, and it failed miserably at the ballot box. Only got about 40% support of the public at the ballot box. So what created this disconnect between this proposal of the mini public and how the whole public voted overall? Well, when we craft questions for a poll, often because we're not trying to persuade people, you lay out an issue and you don't throw out any of the pros and cons, right? But then you lose control over how that issue will be laid out through the political process. So the actual title and summary of a ballot initiative, the thing that voters see right in front of them at the ballot box when they cast that yes or no vote, is written by our Attorney General, who's an elected partisan official. And for whatever reason, the title and summary of this proposition was pretty confusing and didn't really sell the reform as much as the questions the question form that it took on the deliberative poll. And so because we sort of knew this was an issue, we were running polls and did a sort of a split sample poll at the time of the election, where half the people got the proposition as it was framed on the deliberative poll. It was still popular. Half the people got the one that the Attorney General wrote. It was unpopular. So just that control over question writing is something that we in the group hadn't completely anticipated, and something that turned out to be enormously consequential at the ballot box. And so I think that the final lessons for that are you need to keep the expectations clear, both of the participants, because they thought sort of what they said was going to go directly to the ballot, and they'd see how it was written. But also the groups that were involved, in some ways, didn't have the right expectations, hadn't thought through that full political process, and hadn't really synchronized the way that the question was written in the deliberative format with the way it was going to be viewed in the political sphere, when interest groups who are lobbying on it and running lots of ads on it, we hadn't thought through that something that was so popular in this one weekend would get demolished through the political process, right? But that's the reality of a political process. And so I think thinking forward to how the political process is going to grapple with whatever comes out of citizen engagement, is going to make that citizen engagement, it's going to, if you can come up with a clear plan for how that's going to happen, people are going to want to be more interested in participating. They're going to give up those weekends. They're going to give up those weeks because they know there will be real stakes to this. And having, and I think this is what makes the South Australian case, where you have a premier who's so deeply engaged in this, so promising, having a clear sense of, we're going to take this voice of the people and do something with it. That's going to make that voice much more effective and get us much closer to that ideal of citizen deliberation. Thanks very much.